It could also use to educate about the history of caucuses and facilitate their development within the labor movement. The labor movement isn't going to change overnight, so creating those buffer zones will really help us survive things when they get tough. Yeah. That's all I have to say.
I was at a meeting a couple of weeks ago of a national union. I'm not going to name which national union, but it was a meeting of their committees. And they've got committees there's 70 committees, so think of an issue, they have a committee for it. And of 250 or so workers, it was an unbelievably homogeneous group. Women almost made up 50%, but not quite. And this is a public service union, so this is a union with a higher percentage of women involved. It was white. It was a snowstorm in there, and that's always a line that works, man. You should all use it. And there was very few young workers. I asked young workers to identify themselves. Out of 250, I think there were 30. And so I was talking to the organizers, and I said, well, how did these people get in this room? And they said, well, these are our committees, and all of our committees are appointed by the National Executive Board. What? There are people to fill those roles from groups that look like the people you are elected to look like. You know, it is not hard to do this. What it takes is a real commitment and a lot of eating shit for folks kind of like me who like to take up a lot of space, to just take up a little less space, right? I think the labor movement has a lot to learn from its past. There's been years and years of working to involve and include minority groups, and still we've got this issue. So something has not worked. I think this is where the student movement has a lot to teach the labor movement. When I was first elected with Rebecca Rose here at Ryerson University in Toronto, Ryerson University is a very diverse campus. If it's not the most diverse, I think it might rival McMaster University is the most diverse campus in Canada. When we got involved for the first time, the student union executive was 4 white guys. And it was like, where did you even find 4 white guys to get elected? Like, what the hell? And the answer was simple. Who else is going to be like, oh, the leader? It's the white guy. No, not you. But people were just not engaged with the student union. People did not want to get involved with student politics. They did not care about that. Rebecca and I were involved in a really fundamental effort to change the look and the character and the issues of the student movement. Part of that, there was a whole bunch of things that we did, but one of the most fundamental things we did was we spearheaded in the face of a hate crime against Islam. It was Islamophobic crime against Muslim and Muslim-looking students, right? Because to racists, they can't tell the difference. There was a hate crime that happened at the prayer space on campus, and so what happened at Ryerson was the launch of a fundamental study on Islamophobia on campus that spread across all campuses in Ontario. We actually had the first study of its kind on the question of Islamophobia, and proudly we were one of the first groups to even talk about Islamophobia as being a thing. This was in the early 2000s. That was one small thing, but what it did was it fundamentally involved people whose issues had never been part of the student union, ever. And it was, Islamophobia, that is a student issue. Racism, that is a student issue, right? Women's only time in the gym, just an hour a week, that is a student issue because students go to the gym, we have a gym on campus. Very simple links. It was not easy, and we faced a lot of really vicious attacks. Certainly the students who were racialized faced overt racism, shit drawn in posters ripped down. Those of us who were white were called race traitors and had entire blogs dedicated to us from a lot of very prominent racist blogs across Canada. It became national news. We got threats against our lives. And the result of these kind of fundamental changes has been Ryerson's student union executive hasn't been not even a majority white in years. And not even just white, but it's queer students and disabled students involved as well. There's been a fundamental shift in the leadership there, and it's been a really amazing process that to really explain will take too much time. But there are experiences out there, but a lot of people with power need to get knocked around to do this, and that really sucks. And you have to do it in a delicate way, you have to do it in a constructive way, you have to do it in a careful way so that people don't feel alienated. Because the reality is neoliberalism and austerity exist to make people feel divided, to make people be divided in the easiest way. And what is one of the easiest ways to divide us? I'm white, you're not white, we're not the same, right? This is historically the case in Canada and around the world. So we need to see racism and other ways that people divide us as being a tactic. We need to resist this tactic, and we need to fundamentally change how we organize, how we represent ourselves, and how we put ourselves forward to the general public, what issues we advocate for, to make sure that we resist those attacks so we remain stronger united.
Nora already made almost all my points, so thank you. I guess the only thing left I have to say is that, yes, we need to go, we can't expect people to come to the labor movement and say, hey, I want to be involved. You know, we need to go to them. We need to find where they are. And it's really admirable that something like Baristas Rise Up happened, you know, kind of. But with the help, I think of, I can't really talk about this, I don't know a lot about it, with the help of a union organizer. But it's going to those places of employment, or those places of unemployment, like Charlie says, and identifying where that anger is that can be channeled into some kind of action. That's what we need to do.
So we've talked a lot tonight about neoliberalism and the austerity agenda, which is a particular kind of modern capitalism that is kind of the dominant ideology of our ruling class here in Canada and also around the world. The Occupy movement put this really simply, the 99% versus the 1%, those of us who work for a living versus those of us on the very top. So my next question revolves around that question. How can we actually challenge modern capitalism? What can our movement do to do that? And what role do young workers play in the struggle against modern capitalism?
Unions need to begin agitating, educating, and organizing their rank and file on socialist lines. It's not enough to bargain a collective agreement and file grievances. Workers need to know that they have control of the means of production and that they have the power to fight oppression. Unions need to start imagining a better world and stop reinforcing the status quo.
Yeah, I think this is a really tough question for a lot of unions because unions have benefited from capitalism, right? Unionized workers have benefited from capitalism in some way. Not in a fundamental way, not the way the 1% has at all. And capitalism it thrives off of some having some and some having none. And the folks who have some and the folks who have none are easily divided, right? So we really have to have an analysis that says this is a system that is exploiting all of us. When I go to Walmart and I am saving money because I am shopping at Walmart, I am exploiting someone, right? But it has to be done in a way that isn't shaming people. It has to be done in a way that recognizes that I go to Walmart because I can't afford anything else, right? And it has to be done in a way that allows us to see everyone who services us and who we service as being part of the same community, because we are part of the same community. Just as I said, as unionized workers are in this area a privileged group of people, it's a relative privilege, right? It is not Galen Weston level privilege. Although he does seem to get a lot of those little cake pops that seem sweet on those commercials, this is a critical question, and when we have an analysis about how it has both helped us in a minor way, hurt us in a major way, but we can actually translate that major pain into something that's tangible and something that people understand, I think we'll be stronger for it. Unfortunately, a lot of the discourse around capitalism and around socialism and, you know, changing the world, it's pretty dense stuff, right? We don't always talk to people who we need to be talking to. And which was one of the goals that I took with this book. It's like, look, enough of articles that I don't understand. I have a master's degree in education, right? I studied journalism, and there's a lot of crap that I'm like, what the hell does that mean? You know, we gotta start figuring out how to as you say in French, vulgarize this stuff. We have to make it very accessible for people, and we have to start naming giving them names for what they experience. Because it's not that they don't understand, it's that it's not targeted to them, right? It's like trying to get someone to like The Big Bang Theory who has an actual sense of humor, right? It's not possible. For example.
Yeah, I mean, we see the things that capitalism wreaks every day on the news. We see it in, you know, climate change and in the storms. We see it in war. We see it. I mean, you know, we experience. Well, that's the thing. We don't experience it firsthand. We see it. But naming it as capitalism, I think, is important. Like Nora says, and addressing the language of neoliberalism and actually pointing out that it's being used for a reason, and not necessarily succumbing to using the same language, or while we use it, making it clear that, you know, what we're presenting an alternative. Presenting an alternative is an important thing to do, because it's one thing to say we have to fight this, but when you have something to fight for, it's even more powerful.
So on a personal level for me, before I got involved in the labor movement, I was an anti-war activist. I got active politically for the first time around the Iraq War and the hugest demonstrations Canada had ever seen for pro-peace marches. And then I was active in my student union for a year, and then I left university, got a unionized job luckily, and got active in the labor movement. And many activists who come to the labor movement have been active in broader social movement struggles, or continue to be active in broader social movement struggles, whether it's the peace movement, the women's movement, the student movement, or any other the social movements that are the allies of the labor movement. And sometimes the labor movement has collaborated in good ways. We've formed common fronts across the country to combat the austerity agenda, and other times we've collaborated in very bad ways, like in the BC Solidarity example, where the unions actually sold out the social movements. So one of the questions becomes, what role can social movements play in strengthening the labor movement, and how can the labor movement work more closely with our social movement allies?
I think there's absolutely, social movements are key in strengthening the labor movement. Sorry, I see you in the back there, Jackie. I need to speak up. Okay. So I think it's absolutely key that the social movements get involved in the labor movement and work together. There's power in numbers, and the social movements force the labor movement to look at the ways in which class interacts with other forms of oppression, and vice versa. We can work with each other, form coalitions, and organize along the lines of liberation for all.
Yeah, I think on the left, I think there's a clear consensus that we have to be working together, that social movements are the ears on the ground. Outside of the workplace, the labor movement is the ears on the ground. Inside the workplace, together we create a delicious cake. I told you I was drunk, didn't I? No. I just, I'm actually an 80-year-old trapped in a 19-year-old's body. Also a joke. But the problem actually is that that's actually our biggest weakness, right? And we can see that weakness is being exploited by right-wing governments, where they say to workers, look, the labor movement is spending, what was it, on the current I'm sure a lot of people heard Hassan Yusuf's interview on The Current, right? Where they played some random crank talking about how the labor movement spends billions and billions on issues that have nothing to do with workers. It's like, one, yeah, are you crazy? Like, yeah, if we had billions and billions, you wouldn't exist. Right, there'd be like a re-education camp, and he'd be an ally, not an enemy. And two, workers' issues are people's issues are workers' issues. But we don't articulate this very well. And so what we really need to do is find ways to explain to workers how social issues do affect them. They know that. But they need to understand that when they're paying dues to the union, that they will have good representation, they will be represented at the time of bargaining or at the time of a grievance, and we're going to also help to make our communities better. That's the responsibility of the labor movement, to make sure that the membership understands why we have these links. It is not easy, right? In a neoliberal world, that is not a given. It should be the default position. It is not the default position. So we need to push it towards the default position. What then we have to figure out is, how do we create a system where we have a political party amplifying the demands of the social and the labor movement together, right? And I think Quebec has become the closest to that, but the Quebec labor movement is also, I would argue, one of the most conservative labor movements in Canada, right? So this is a very difficult question. I think we're just doing the questions that were prepared, and then there's going to be right after that.
With the group here, the audience?
Yeah. Right on, yeah. And so even in Quebec, where things are pretty good, there's still a lot to do. So we have to better marry and have to better create solidarity between social activists, labor activists, bring in the people who are not there at the table now, who need to be, and then figure out how to use a political party to amplify our positions and our voices in a more official way, or get rid of the political system. I don't know which is going to come first, but we might have to do the political party thing first.
Yeah, I mean, I think Nora mentioned already the student movement and what the Canadian Federation of Students does. I mean, I'd love to talk about it, because I do think that it's a particularly it's an example of an organization that tries to take democracy to the extreme, in the sense that we have representatives from these constituencies. We go through motions at our general meetings. We look at them in all kinds of lenses, and we try to address, the issues that or the movements that everyone's coming from. I mean, something like that for the labor movement, great. How to do it? Harder, but I think work is already happening to do it. So keep on doing it. Okay.
So I've got two more questions that I'm going to go through with our panelists. So the next one, Nora spoke about Margaret Thatcher, the Iron Lady. When she died, we actually had fireworks at my house that night. But she had a slogan that was put out there pretty broadly. It's called TINA, there is no alternative. And that was the argument behind the neoliberal cuts that began in Britain, with the slashing of the National Health Service, cuts to post-secondary and primary education, and all sorts of social programs that people needed. Historically, the labor movement was founded around an idea about changing society. It wasn't about gaining $1 more an hour here, or a dental plan there, or a pension plan there. It was about a fundamental belief that we as workers collectively could shape our own future and change the society that we live in. Unfortunately, in recent years, the labor movement has stopped talking about this alternative view of society. I would call that socialism. Not everybody would. Other folks have different words for it. But we haven't talked about an alternative vision to capitalism itself, beyond some very basic reforms to the system. So the question is, what can we do as young workers to create and push an alternative vision of economics and our society?
I think that we need to start by talking to our coworkers and the rank and file, and start planting seeds. Maybe you start with a conversation at work about imagining life without the boss, and working your way all the way up to overthrowing capitalism. It's a long process and it takes patience, I'm sure. But seriously, we could develop socialist lesson plans and have resources for shop stewards ready to disseminate.
I think that we get so caught up in the big picture stuff that we actually forget that there's a lot of really minor policies that need to be enacted as well. And after having an NDP government that was more or less a disappointment, it feels like there are no alternatives, right? Like, look at the Ontario election right now. I don't know how many of you are watching it as closely as I am. I am an Ontarian technically, or I was born there and I lived there for most of my life. And it is so depressing. You want to look at an example of there are no alternatives, it is the Ontario election, right? It is three parties that are basically fighting on the most narrow plane you can imagine, thinking that that's what the majority of people are. I think that we need to rely on the work being done by organizations like the CCPA. They aren't paying me anymore, so all of my praise is like totally just because I think they're great. Yeah, I don't make any royalties off the book, so. The research that they do, the alternative budgets, are the proof that it is possible, right? It's like, when you talk to someone, you're like, look, we can have free higher education. They're like, socialist! And you're like, no, look, here. They're like, oh yeah, there it is, right? The only thing that they can say to that is, you're still a socialist, which is nothing, right? Yeah, we have the arguments, we have the facts. We have organizations, this is where social movements come in. We have the organizations that crunch those numbers, that give economic arguments for why certain things are possible. And when you start looking at those alternatives, well, you have a situation like in Quebec, where the party that I'm a part of, first time I've been a member of a political party in my life, the last provincial election, we were talking about free education, higher education. We were saying, if we are elected in the first year, we are going to make education free. We are going to present projet de loi, a bill to create Pharma Quebec. We are going to lower the cost of childcare, which already is only $7 a day. Right? There are alternatives that exist already that we don't have to get too creative to implement. And the problem is what we need is vision, which we are, if vision in our leadership on the left was a currency, we would be broke, right? We'd be borrowing from the conservatives. That's what's happening right now. Yeah, that's exactly the metaphor. And we need charisma. We need to actually have these arguments with people in a way that shows that these are credible possibilities. These are not harebrained. These are not impossible. There are countries around the world where free education is the standard. Actually, there's countries where being paid to be a student is the standard, right? How does Finland do it? They don't live in the clouds with like sugar growing out of the ground that they all get to lick all the time because it's delicious. They are a real country. Finland exists, right? They're not unicorns. So we and a lot of these things are really simple, right? A lot of these things are in. A lot of these things have been studied. If you want to look at the childcare example model, for example, look at Quebec. Look at how much money is dropped into the government and into the government coffers from having women in the workforce.
That's called rebellion.
In Quebec,
guys, this is not going to work.
It's cool, man. No, we're just
Finland is a glorified prison, okay?
Yeah.
Everything on this
But no.
You're interrupting right now. I'm going to ask you to sit down.
I'm not a worker. I'm a human being. We're not consumers. We're human beings.
Totally, we totally agree.
Okay, cool.
It's cool. No, it's cool, man. I'm not a worker. I'm actually
You're
a worker.
interrupting this panel, and I'm asking you to sit
That's
down.
resistance and it's rebellion. And that's my point, and that's what I want to make.
And you're
By the
right.
way, yes. And by the
Interrupting
way,
a woman on
I have a response, by the way, to these problems.
Great, brother, there's a panel going on right now.
And
Can
then
you
I'll leave.
please?
My response is Permea, okay? And that's at the Permaculture Research Institute. It's formative.
You're not helping your cause right now.
Permaculture and Pangea.
Okay, cool.
Check it out.
Wicked, thanks,
Take
man.
care.
Yeah.
Best of luck for all of us, because our world is going down.
Totally.
Protest is rebellion, and that's what we need more of. Okay? Less proof thing, and more rebellion. Solidarity, guys.
Yeah. But we have the statistics in Quebec to show what the impact of childcare is, right? It's actually many, many billions of dollars into the economy. More women are working. It's very simple. It can be enacted anywhere, right? So when we're talking about confronting this logic that there is no alternative, we need to say, sorry, the emperor is naked, and here are the alternatives. Here are the robes that we would like to put on the emperor, and one includes a ball and chain, and we'll put him somewhere else.
I just think we need Nora Loreto to, I don't know, take the lead. Here we go. Well, yeah, I mean, there are a lot of points to be made. I mean, a lot of people have ideas for alternatives, and that's a good thing. We need lots of ideas, like Nora says. Enacting those ideas, I guess, needs maybe a change in the way we actually govern ourselves. And, I mean, Nora mentioned the elections in Quebec, federal elections. You know, our democracy right now isn't working for us in the same way that capitalism isn't working for us, I would argue. And that's something that we do need to address, and that's what, you know, that's something that the federal government recognizes, you know, with Bill C-23, the Unfair Elections Act. That's, I mean, a pretty conscious attempt to, you know, stamp out any resistance that they face. And so that's also something we need to organize around, and that we do organize around. Yeah.
So, one final question for our panelists before we jump into some questions from the audience. Right now, the right wing is really pushing an argument of intergenerational conflict. We see this specifically in some of the cuts the Harper government has made to, for example, old age security, where now most of us in this room are going to need to work for 2 more years in order to actually collect a pension. So this happens in the labor movement in a very big way, and employers use the intergenerational conflict between older and younger workers to drive divisions in a union. Specifically, there's 2 ways of doing this. The first one, when we've talked about it a little bit, is around 2-tiered wages or 2-tiered contracts. That means that they convince older workers that the only way to save jobs is to cut the wages and benefits that new and younger workers receive in the workplace. And then, once they've won that, they come back 10 years later to make the argument to the younger workers that we can't afford this pension plan that the older workers have anymore, we need to get rid of the pension plan, and they try to convince younger workers to vote for that. So it's a 2-tiered process for them. They understand the steps. Get the older workers to sell out the younger workers, and then it's highly unlikely that the younger workers will stand in solidarity with the older workers when you come after the pension plan next round of bargaining. So what can we do to combat intergenerational conflict in our workplaces? And more importantly, how can we as younger activists in the labor movement learn from an older generation's experience while not getting trapped in the "this is how we've always done it" mentality, which is huge in the labor movement?
Both sides need to search and identify their allies on either side. Similar to how students and teachers have worked together in strike situations, budget cuts, and tuition hikes, we need to campaign in solidarity with one another. We need to get better at patiently explaining to one another. Elders need to tell their stories while being open to new ideas. Young folks need to hear those stories, and they need to use their historical leverage to guide a new intergenerational strategy.
Yeah, I talked a lot about this afternoon. I think exploiting the generational differences is so easy, right? In Ontario, when Dalton McGuinty wanted to hike tuition fees by more than 80%, which he did in the 2000s, right? What he did was he allowed tuition fees to increase at 8% for first-year students and at 5% for second, third, fourth-year students. Okay, what does that do? Well, it's obvious, right? The first-year students are like, oh, these fees are really expensive. They don't have a benchmark to know how much more expensive they are. It's a very disenfranchising, very neoliberal way to inflict the maximum pain on a group of people. And so what we need to do is have balance on these issues. We need to balance pensions and job security. Those like kind of the 2 ends of where young workers and older workers issues can be at odds with each other. And we need to have true intergenerational solidarity. This means a translation of what we're talking about when young workers look at older workers, you see how I did that, and say, why are you keeping me out of the union? Why are you keeping me out of my job? When older workers look at younger workers, say, I had it so hard too. We need to recognize that it is the hardest ever, unquestionably, for younger workers today, maybe in the post-war period, and that older workers need to get that and need to accept that. But young workers also have to understand that it is also the hardest time for older workers. So we're all being squeezed. There's no one being squeezed more or less. But where this really gets tricky is when your bargaining unit is not comprised of younger and older workers. And I'll give you a quick example. QP Local in BC, in Vancouver, outdoor workers. Their union was made of 40%, 60% younger workers, older workers. The 60% younger workers were precarious, mostly summer employed, right? Like landscaping, parks, and this kind of stuff. The older workers were the permanent ones at the 40%. The contract was tied to government legislation, and so when they were given breaks was determined by a change in labor legislation that the BC Liberals enacted. What it effectively did was eliminate the right to a break over a 5-hour workday for younger workers. Okay? When bargaining came up, the bargaining committee, which was made up of the 40% of the older workers, they asked for submissions from all the workers. What do you want us to do? The younger workers said, we want a break. Duh, right? What are you going to do? Break. The older workers said, we can't advocate for that break because we will lose our break in this process. And so they didn't. Okay? The younger worker who raised this issue said, what am I supposed to say when it comes up time for decertification vote from the outdoor workers, the summer students? What am I supposed to say? That the unions got their back? They don't. This is a really difficult issue that I think is more common than we probably want to admit. I think leadership needs to identify these issues and help work with older workers to understand why things like this are not possible. And we need to figure out how to create solidarity so that you have situations like the Cup W workers who actually went on strike to protect the rights of future workers, which I think is one of the greatest things that the CUPW has done. And it's no surprise that they're the union that Stephen Harper wants to break.
Well, another round of applause for all three of our panelists. In just a moment, I'm going to take 4 questions. I'm going to take them all at once, and then I'll let our panelists respond, and that's all we're going to have time for. But I'm going to ask Tori to give a quick announcement about the People's Social Forum, which is happening at the end of August, and is an effort to bring together folks in Ottawa to help combat the Harper government. Tori?
Yeah, so that's the general gist of it. The vision is to bring together different types of movements, so reaching out to environmentalists, the I Don't Know More movement, labor movements, and trying to bring experiences from individual struggles to collective action and being able to talk between each other to create a really great movement against the neoliberal agenda in Canada and not just look at defeating Harper, but what we want as alternatives beyond that. I think we all can get on board with that vision, so to make that happen, we have a couple caravans going from across the Atlantic. If you're interested in helping to organize these or to just hop on board, you can email us at PSF Nova Scotia. There's also a few flyers over here on the table, or come talk to myself, or if anybody else wants to raise their hand if they're comfortable being approached about People's Social Forum. No, just calling it out there. Yeah, it'll be a really great bringing together of different communities. As Kyle said, August 21st to 24th in Ottawa, and we'll be helping with transportation costs from Halifax as well as going through New Brunswick and across the Atlantic.
Thanks, Tori. Okay, so I'm going to take 4 questions. We're going to then give them to the panelists to respond to. We're not going to have folks respond after each question, but we'll take all 4 at once first. So hands up. There. Somewhere else. Okay, you're the only one so far. First question.
Now I'm going to try not to use this as a soapbox, but
thank you.
First of all, my first, before you get too hard on that fellow that outbursted there, I've been waiting patiently to not necessarily do the same thing, but my main question is, well, you mentioned that the trade unions aren't the most cooperative. I'm part of Local 83, and I want to know where the trade unions are. Now, we have a next meeting coming up every Tuesday. First meeting, for the first. See, I've had a lot of caffeine, and my outrage and frustration is cyclical, and right now it's peaking. And we have a meeting coming up, and so I'm going to raise a question for them, the panel, the white dudes up there, every single one of them dudes, except for one woman, so that they can say she's there. Where's the representative for the apprentices? Where's the representative for the young workers there?
Sorry, Local 83, which union?
That's the Carpenters Union, and that's the problem, is that I actually asked some of the organizers and representatives of the Carpenters Union, do you guys know what's going on here? Why are you guys involved? And although they are dedicated, they see it as a 9-to-5 job. Oh, that's on a Saturday, we can't come. So, I guess, can you guys explain to me where the disconnect is? I mean, the fact that, not to be too hard on you, Local 83 is the Carpenters Union of Nova Scotia. It's part of the ACRC Atlantic. And I just want to know where the disconnect is, and I'll let you know what happens with the apprenticeship representative thing. So I'm going to sit down now.
Other questions? Wow, we answered them all, eh? Erin?
What do you do for young workers around, I've been involved in a union drive in one of my former workplaces. There was a lot of fear mongering that happened, and I feel lately when I saw through Brew how your union really supported folks there in second cup and whatever, and they came out and they really supported the people that were fired and whatever after that cause. There's a lot of fear that goes, I think, when I talk to young workers in the last place that I worked, it's always like, no, we can't unionize, we'll get fired, blah, 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 and the word on the street is or people will sign their cards and then the boss will come back and tell them all the bad things that are going to happen, what they're going to lose if they follow through with that, so then they don't follow through with organizing, and then people get fired, so the word on the street is really cyclical around, don't unionize, you're going to get fired, and it's really scary, and so I think I always hear the talks about how unions are so great and whatever, but how do we practice actually really supporting young people and overcoming the fear, the very real fear that they have, because it's on the one hand they want more security, but they're going to lose that, they feel they're going to really jeopardize their employment by even talking about a union or anything, so can you respond to me educating or increasing awareness and actually displaying support for young people?
Thanks. In the back.
I think one of the things that all the panelists touched on is sort of the way that work has changed over the last 20, 30, 40 years. And one of the things that I've seen as someone who's worked in a variety of small workplaces is that the idea, the old model of being able to go into a hospital and organize a hospital is done. They're all either organized or they're not going to be organized, right? So one of the problems is that a lot of people like me work in workplaces where the fireman unit is going to be 2, 3, 4, 5 people. And the unions that are willing to organize those places, particularly in the private sector, organizing those places costs more money than they will ever raise in dues. Just the organizing drive and the first contract is going to cost more than they'll ever get out of us in dues. But the problem is that the unions that are well-resourced, particularly in the private sector, or in the public sector rather, aren't going to organize those spaces because they're public sector unions and most of these jobs are in the private sector. So I'm curious if any of the panelists have thoughts on ways in which this particular organizing problem can be solved, either by increasing dues to central organizations and having, things like the CLC or the Federation of Labor actually organizing these small places, or whether it's a matter of public sector unions increasing the scope of who they're willing to organize. But it strikes me that there's been some straight up the SEIU, the only way to describe the organizing work that's been happening there is heroic, right? The amount of work that people have put in of sitting in parking lots all night to get one card signed is it's heroic. But other unions, the best resourced unions, haven't stepped up to do the same job, and it leaves those of us in smaller workplaces, particularly in the private or not-for-profit sector, in a situation where it's hard to get someone to answer your calls, or people will answer your call and be apologetic. And I was wondering if people have strategies to overcome this, because the reality is that those are the places to organize. So is it a question of organizing geographically instead of workplaces? Is it a question of organizing entire sectors? Is it a question of changing who does the organizing? I just wonder if people have thoughts on that.
Okay, and last question right there.
Kind of building on that, if we're struggling to have solidarity organizing, in terms of organizing smaller workplaces, it's time to organize our entire society. And so what is the role of joining political parties? It's a little self-serving because I'm the provincial secretary for the NDP, but the reality is that we need to do those kinds of radical things and talk about values, and I'd like to hear the panelists a little bit more on the value of actually doing that hard work and having those value discussions, and how we make that movement happen to create larger scale change than we were able to accomplish. So I think that's the way to go.
Great. So we've got 4 questions. The first one around the role of individual local unions, knowing or not knowing about stuff going on in our movement, and the role of staff. The next one is around younger workers, the fear involved in organizing, and how we protect people who actually get fired. The third question is around the changing conditions of work, smaller bargaining units, and strategies for actually actualizing that. And then finally, the broader question of organizing society, joining political parties and larger movements.
And do you want us to make these summative comments as well?
Yeah, if you want to kind of wrap up your thoughts as well, we'll do that.
I feel like the first question you would do a better answer. But that's not.
Just on the specifics of that one, the Carpenters Union actually left the Canadian Labour Congress several years ago, so that's why your folks are not plugged in. You need to get them.
Apparently rejoined.
No, they haven't.
They have not rejoined.
They told me they did. And they're working on something.
Well, we hope that they will. So.
I hope so too. I hope so too. I hope so too.
I don't know, do you want to respond to that? Or?
I'll just do a huge chunk, so I'm going to do summative as well. So. Yeah. Okay. Sure. Okay. Yeah. Getting people involved. You know, like you folks are the ones who know your workplace the best, right? If people will not come to a meeting on Saturday, do not hold a meeting on Saturday. It's simple, but it happens all the time. People are like, "Oh, no one came to a meeting at 6 o'clock on a Tuesday." It's like, did you have food? No. People are having supper. You know, like people eat. People have kids, they have to pick them up from school, right? We have to be clever about how we're organizing. If we're serious about getting people involved, we need to look at the conditions of work and find the way to plug people in. It's not going to look the same for the Carpenters Union as it is going to look for teachers, right? Doesn't mean it doesn't have to look the same, right? It's about the goal. It isn't about how we're plugging people in. So I really encourage people who have a desire to bring a lot of this politic to their workplace, to find those creative ways to get people involved. I don't know much about your trade, but maybe it's like having hacksaws that say like solidarity forever, right? I don't know. This is what happens when you have someone who doesn't know give an idea. Maybe that's a good idea. I don't know. but there's ways to get people involved, and a lot of those times the ways are actually really obvious. You just think that it's so obvious that it can work, but what it is that it's so obvious people just haven't done it, right? It's like hiding something in plain sight. Fighting against fear and tactics like that is a really difficult reality because everyone is afraid, right? People who have a good job are afraid of losing their good job. People who have a bad job are afraid of losing their bad job. People who are unemployed are afraid of losing EI or never getting a job, right? We have to build a community where it's not one person sticking out their neck, it's 10 people sticking out their neck, right? You want to fire one person? Fire 10 people. Bring it, right? Okay, you got 10 people fired, now you have to fight for them. A really good example of this was when the Porter airplane fuelers went on strike. Okay, so Porter is I'm sure you all know Porter Airlines, right? Free wine, it's great. But it's not unionized except for certain elements of their workers, and one was this bargaining unit of 20-some fuelers on the Toronto Island Airport. That was a really hard strike because operations continued. It was only 27 people, and they were easily the scab labor was brought in to just fuel the jets, right? There was a lot of solidarity offered by the labour movement across Canada, and particularly in Toronto, from the Toronto York Region Labour Council, which is also a very labour council in Canada, and they won. It took months, but they did win. So we need to be committed. If we're going to encourage people to stick out their necks, we need to be there to embarrass the company, go to the press, do everything we can to tell their stories, and don't think it's it's not possible to tell your story in the mainstream press. It's not easy, but it's totally possible. We just need to be clever about how we do it. So if you're thinking of doing something that would be considered extreme or could result in someone losing their job, reach out to people like Kyle, reach out to people within the Canadian Labour Congress and find ways to do it. Or think of different ways that aren't going to get you fired, but that will also make your point, right? There's a lot of creative escalating tactics that you can take that won't get you fired, or if it did, like people got fired for wearing green. Like people lose their minds. That doesn't make any sense. Find those pressure points within your workplaces. Get creative. Organizing small workplaces and the whole economies of scale in terms of organizing small workplaces, that's a really difficult question too, because labor in a lot of cases operates kind of in a corporate mentality. I think that to confront the success of capitalism, a lot of labor unions kind of think, well, capitalism is winning with these tactics, so we can take the tactics of capitalism and fight it, right? It's like, no, they built the game. You're not going to beat them at the game they built. They know the secret codes and you don't, right? Or the cheats, as we used to call them when we had Nintendo. We have to get really clever about beating people at their own game. And if that means not organizing unions and finding alternative structures to support people, we do that. If that means giving people the representation and everything that they need to fight against their work and improve their work environments, then it means that. It means that if a group of residence assistants comes to you saying, look, we've signed union cards, you don't turn them away if you're a national public sector union, right? That was a bit of a screw up, and we can talk a little bit later about that story, and I'm not going to get into more, you don't know about it, you can Google it, it's very interesting. But these are very high stakes issues that often require working outside of the mainstream labor movement, right? It's not a huge surprise. After 80 years of the modern labor movement, capital has figured out how to win, right? So we can't get mad if our tactics are not working as well as they should, because Walmart has figured out how to crush the union, right? So let's get creative, let's share our ideas, and in a situation like that, I can think immediately of QP 1281, a really good example of a small composite local, a local which I was a manager of and also a member of, that has its problems, but also demonstrates that it's totally possible to organize small workplaces. It's hard, it's resource intensive, but it's totally possible. And my God, after being at the Canadian Labour Congress meeting a couple weeks ago, the labor movement does not have billions and billions of dollars, but they do have money, and they aren't always spending it wisely, right, in the best way. So I'll just finish by saying, I think we all know this, but it's so important to say, like, you folks are the power, right? They have the plant and we have the power, as Lisa Simpson said, right? It is not possible to run society if it's not being run by us. And so we have to know and act as if we have the power. Because if we keep saying, oh my God, they're going to fire me, they will fire you, right? Things won't get better. So go back to your workplaces, keep doing the work that I know that you're all doing, inspire people to come along who aren't already at the table, and when the going gets tough, reach out to Kyle and other people who can help you out, and do what the Baristas did, make it a national issue, start unionizing these workplaces that apparently are impossible to unionize, and change the world from the ground up.
Can't really follow
I
that.
told you to go next, that's my thing.
We have a petition on the table. It's about tuition fees and student debt. We'd love it if you sign. But I think Nora is totally right in saying that community is what we need and what strengthens us. And so it's great to have something like this. And well, creativity for everyone. I mean, like, I don't have a monopoly on anything, particularly ideas. And so, if we want to talk about creating even, the last question about, how to incorporate these ideas into, political structures, I mean, we need to get together and talk about it because, even the smallest spark can light fire. Well, I'll end by that.
Yeah, so I just want to answer Aaron's question around how do we get over being afraid. And I think fear ends when anger begins. You have to be madder than hell to overcome the fear of losing a job when you're trans and you know that finding a job is going to be hell. For two reasons. It's going to be difficult to find an employer who will hire you without discriminating against you. And also, if you do find that employer, it's just going to be hell explaining to them, no, I go by they. Like, I'm going to have to go through a whole other set of problems just to get another job. And the other job isn't going to be a better alternative. It's going to be just as shitty, if not worse. And so why not start a union? I mean, to me, it was the only solution, really.
Okay, one final round of applause for our three panelists. A huge thank you to the Public Service Alliance of Canada Atlantic, the Halifax-Dartmouth District Labour Council, the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, the Canadian Federation of Students, and Solidarity Halifax. If you are a union member in this room and you are not a delegate to the Labour Council yet, please talk to me afterwards. No one leaves till that's done. And again, if you're interested in checking out Nora's book, there are copies for sale at the back. She will be signing some autographs, so make sure you check that out. And finally, there's some information about Solidarity Halifax at the back too. If you're an anti-capitalist rebel rouser and you're not a member yet, I'm not sure why. So check that out as well. Thank you all so much for coming out tonight. This has been absolutely fantastic. You're going to be able to see it recorded. If you want to watch it again, send it to your friends, check out the live tweeting, and see you in the streets.